Hey, what's up everyone? So today we're going to go over chapter 3 of Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning. This is the book that we use to study for the NSCA CSCS exam. And so let's dive right in. This chapter is about bioenergetics of exercise and training. So we're going to discuss some basic definitions regarding bioenergetics first, okay? So there's catabolism and anabolism, which are two opposite things. Catabolism, like this picture shows here, catabolism, cat likes to break things down, right? So catabolism is when you break a bigger molecule down in order to generate more energy, okay? And then anabolism is the exact opposite of that. You're building stuff up. And then metabolism is a combination of those two things. And bioenergetics and how our body functions in order to reproduce energy, that's what it's all about, really. And so those two things in combination happen simultaneously 24/7, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. All right, so cool. ATP hydrolysis, I included this example here just in case, but we're going to go into a lot more detail in later slides. And so just remember ATP hydrolysis. With that, you release energy, and ADP, inorganic phosphate, and hydrogen ion is also released as well. With the phosphagen system, this is also known as the anaerobic system. And so with phosphagen system, it's important to note that it relies on the hydrolysis of ATP and breakdown of creatine phosphate, which is CP right here, okay? And so this is the first system that kind of kicks in when you're working out or exercising for a short amount of time. And also note that it is driven by law of mass action, which means there's a whole chemistry equation regarding law of mass action, but just know for this sake, just know that the concentration of molecules and matters is what drives the action. And so I don't know if you guys have watched my previous videos on chapter 1 and chapter 2, but how the pressure gradient works in order to bring air in and out of our lungs is a good example of law of mass action. And so that's really how the phosphagen system functions. And then for glycolysis, which is the next system that we're going to talk about, this is all about breaking down carbs. So when we break down the carbs and the glycogen in the muscles or the glucose in our blood, it is used to resynthesize ATP. Okay, that's the whole point of all these systems, is to resynthesize ATP so we can use them as a fuel or a source of energy. And so with that results pyruvate, which is right here. So important to remember with glycolysis, we break down carbs. They either are in form of glycogen or glucose, and at the end of that, it results in pyruvate. And after it turns into pyruvate, it goes to either fast glycolysis, which is also known as the Cori cycle, or slow glycolysis, which is also known as the Krebs cycle. So focusing on the big picture here right now, I'm not too worried about how many ATPs are made with these cycles, but focusing more on where they go and what kind of cycles they go through is very important. And so with fast glycolysis, the whole point is to convert them to lactate. Okay, so we talk about the lactate threshold, and we're going to talk about that in the next slide. But with the lactate that are converted into glucose, and then it goes to the liver. Okay, so that's the first part. With the Cori cycle is the lactate, how it gets converted into glucose and then goes to the liver. Okay, so also important to remember with the Cori cycle, lactate is not the cause of tissue fatigue. So a lot of times we think that, oh, this person has reached the lactate threshold, which is when the anaerobic mechanism kicks in to be used as the primary source of energy. But we're going to discuss that later. But keep in mind, lactate is not the cause of tissue fatigue, okay? And so moving on to the second kind of glycolysis, it's the slow glycolysis. And this is when the broken down carbs, which turns to pyruvate, goes to the mitochondria. And this is more closer to the oxidative system. And the oxidative aerobic or oxidative mechanisms to make more ATP, right, than fast glycolysis, which is closer to anaerobic. All right, and so I'm gonna write down here anaerobic, N for fast glycolysis, and then aerobic for slow glycolysis. And so now the pyruvate that was converted earlier goes to mitochondria, goes through the Krebs cycle, and now is converted into acetyl-CoA. Okay, this is an enzyme that is used with other molecules to resynthesize ATP. That's good to know. And then with NADHD entering the electron transport chain, which is called ETC, now we can synthesize more ATP. So this is really the big picture stuff here. For me, this was sufficient enough to study with, and I did fine on the test, and so focus on the big picture stuff. All right, and then here is a graph of how many ATPs are made. I'm not going to go into too much detail here with this. If you want to look over it, feel free to do that. All right, so before we move on to the third and final energy system, the oxidative system, we're going to cover metabolic acidosis and lactate threshold real quick. Okay, so metabolic acidosis is exercise-induced decrease in pH, and so whenever we work out or exercise, our pH is going to decrease, but it is really, really important to remember that the lactic acid does not cause metabolic acidosis. So we think, oh, because the lactic acid starts building up, our system becomes more acidic, therefore the pH decreases, but that is not the case. All right, lactic acid does not cause metabolic acidosis. All right, lactate threshold, I mentioned this earlier in the previous slide, and this is when someone is exercising and the reliance on the anaerobic mechanisms to produce ATP becomes higher and higher. So you're relying on that fast glycolysis on the anaerobic side more and more, and lactate threshold is when you start doing that as an athlete. Okay, so that is important to keep in mind. Typically for a person like me, who is not a professional athlete, I mean, I work out a decent amount of times, but typically for an average person, the lactate threshold is usually seen at 50 to 60% of the max oxygen uptake, whereas for trained athletes, it's 70 to 80% of their max oxygen uptake, and so their lactate threshold is higher, meaning their anaerobic mechanisms don't really have to kick in for way later than for people like me. Okay, the third and final energy system that we're going to talk about is the oxidative system. So this uses carbs and fat as substrates, and there are two ways to generate ATP. Okay, we're going to discuss this later in later chapters in much more detail, but for now, just know that oxidative system loves using fat as a fuel. So if you see a marathon runner or a triathlon athlete, they use a lot of fat as their fuel to keep going, so just keep that in mind if you can. And so fat oxidation, like I said, is free fatty acids that enter mitochondria and that gets broken down, and we discussed this enzyme earlier, acetyl-CoA, and hydrogen protons are generated for energy source. Also for protein oxidation, proteins broken down into amino acids and they end up as ATP, and we use that as an energy source. Okay, so we're going to start with an athletic event that lasts 0 to 6 seconds. We're just going to say that in football, it's a running back making a play. Okay, that usually doesn't last that long unless he gets to extend the play a little more, but a typical run play, the intensity of this event is going to be extremely high. Okay, and we're going to rely heavily on our phosphagen system, which is, if you remember, it's the anaerobic system that we talked about, the very first one. Okay, and then an event that lasts between 6 to 30 seconds, For this one, we're just gonna say in basketball and NBA or WNBA, when you have the ball and you're trying to get a bucket, that's usually when phosphagen and fast glycolysis kicks in to be able to create that energy for us to move efficiently. And so 6 to 30 seconds, the intensity is very high, and that's when we use phosphagen and fast glycolysis. So just for better understanding, I'm gonna create a chart here, our linear line, and then here is our phosphagen, which is the most anaerobic. Here is our glycolysis, and then here is our oxidative system. So like I said, this is 0 to 6 seconds. 0 to 6 seconds. Here is our fast glycolysis and phosphagen system, which is 6 to 30 seconds. And then glycolysis is 30 seconds to 2 minutes. So here, I'm just gonna say a soccer player trying to carry the ball up the field like a midfielder. You're jogging. You're not sprinting, but you're also not jogging. You're kind of in the middle. So the intensity of the event is high, and you're using fast glycolysis at this point. So 30 seconds to 2 minutes, fast glycolysis. All right, next up is 2 to 3 minutes, and this is moderate intensity of event, and here we're using fast glycolysis and oxidative system. So we're leaning more towards oxidative system now. All right, so I'm just gonna write here 2 to 3 minutes, and we're right here. So let's say this is another soccer example. We're kind of passing the ball around, trying to see where we can attack, or even lacrosse, where you're just passing the ball around, seeing if there's any open spots. And so an event that takes about 2 to 3 minutes, we're using fast glycolysis and oxidative system. And then finally, for oxidative system, at the very end of the spectrum, this is going to be 3 minutes plus. Okay, so a very easy example is marathon, right? So with marathon, it's definitely going to take more than 3 minutes. And so although the intensity of the event is low, meaning you're going at a lower intensity for a long period of time, it's going to last the longest. And so we are going to rely on the oxidative system. All right, so next up, we're going to look at the rankings of rate and capacity of ATP production. Even before looking at this chart, just know that they are inversely related, meaning the rate of which a system can make ATPs, how fast that can make it, is inversely related to how many ATPs it can make. And so if the phosphagen system makes the ATPs relatively quickly, it means that they can't make as many ATPs as the oxidative system. Okay, it's going to make more sense as we look at this chart. But for the phosphagen system, which is right here, the rate of ATP production it's ranked as number 1. So it means that it can generate ATPs the fastest. But the capacity of ATP production, meaning how many ATPs it can create, is ranked number 5. So you see what I mean by, yes, it can generate ATPs very fast, but the number of ATPs it can generate is the lowest out of all the systems here. The opposite end of the spectrum, oxidation of fats and proteins. Remember I told you that the oxidative system relies on fat and protein oxidation. That's why it's fats and proteins here. There's also carbs, but the opposite end, yes, they make the most amount of ATPs because our aerobic or endurance athletes need a lot of ATPs, right, to be able to keep up with their sports for a long period of time. But the rate of how fast they make these ATPs ranked number 5, and so that's what this chart is all about. Let me know if you have any questions on this chart, by the way. All right, so moving on to oxygen deficit and debt. A very simple way to remember this is loans, like student loans that I have or you might have. But looking at this chart, with the deficit here, this is where we need to borrow some oxygen from the anaerobic mechanisms, where ideally we'd be able to pay for all this oxygen with our oxidative system, but we can't afford that, so we have to borrow that from anaerobic mechanisms. Okay, like I had to borrow money to go to PT school, and so this is the deficit. Okay, the amount of oxygen that we borrow, because this is the VO2 max, or VO2 that's required for a certain exercise, and we're not there. We have this much oxygen that we need, that we don't have, so we borrowed it. Boom, there we go. And then of course we got to pay it back, right? That's the only way that this works. And so EPOC is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, meaning this is the debt that we have to pay back after we're done with our exercise here. So technically this is the recovery phase, but because we have the oxygen debt, we're still paying the oxygen back. Like, I have to pay the bank money with interest rate for my loans even after I'm done with school or exercise. And so that's what this chart is all about. All right, the most important chart of the day, interval training. Like I said with this chart here, let me bold it. This chart comes back all the time. Okay, so very important to know this chart. Very important. So interval training, what it is we're simulating our system, our body, and our system, our energy system, to kind of be able to adapt to the sport well when we actually perform in our sports. And so we're gonna target certain systems to be stressed in order to simulate that situation, like I talked about, right? So let's start with the phosphagen, like we always do. With phosphagen, the percent of maximum power says 90 to 100. Like I said, it's very quick, short burst of speed, energy, and force, and it doesn't last long, right? We talked about it earlier with the running back making plays. Here it says 5 to 10 seconds. Earlier it says 0 to 6. Okay, give or take. Let's say up to 10 seconds, right? Typical exercise time is 10 seconds. And so you gotta be able to rest a lot after that, right? I mean, you worked really, really hard for a short amount of time, and you gotta recover. And so the work to rest ratio is the biggest out of all the systems. It's 1 to 12 to 1 to 20. This is extremely important to remember. And then the next system is fast glycolysis. So like we talked about in the spectrum, this is closer to the anaerobic side than to the aerobic or oxidative side. Okay, so we're still at about 75 to 90% of our maximum power. And like I said, this is the midfielder in soccer, bringing the ball up the field. It's almost a sprint, trying to avoid tackles, and a lot of things going on. So boom, 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 and it lasts 15 to 30 seconds, give or take. All right, and here the work to rest ratio is 1 to 3 to 1 to 5. So I'll give you an example of what work to rest ratio is. And so if you worked for 1 minute, let's say, or I guess it makes more sense to work for a midfielder to bring up the field. I don't know if there's any soccer fans here, but Euro is just about to finish, and we'll just say Pogba from France, he was carrying the ball up the field for 20 seconds. Okay, after he does that, if we're using the fast glycolysis as a energy system, he needs to have a break, whether that's just jogging lightly or however he takes a break during the game. If he brings the ball up the field for 20 seconds, he needs to have a break for 20 times 3 to 20 times 5, because this ratio, right, is 20 seconds, so that's 60 seconds, either 60 seconds or 100 seconds. Okay, so just remember that number. Moving on to the next system, it's the fast glycolysis and oxidative. So now we're closer to the oxidative side, and now we're not using as much power as we can. We're only using 30 to 75% of our maximum power, and so our exercise can last longer, 1 to 3 minutes. That's a pretty long time. And so let's go back to soccer. This isn't necessarily bringing the ball up the field, but we're passing the ball around the back, just to pass the ball around to see if there's any openings, right? And so this lasts about 1 to 3 minutes, and so the work to rest ratio is going to be a little lower because we didn't work as intensively as we did earlier. We don't really deserve that much break, and so the work to rest ratio here is 1 to 3 to 1 to 4, which is pretty close to fast glycolysis, right? All right, so the final energy system we're going to talk about is the oxidative system. So I'm going to find another color here. Same color. All right, so the oxidative system here is our last system. We're going at 20 to 30% of our maximum power. Okay, so not as intense. And also it lasts more than 3 minutes. So the marathon example that I gave earlier, a great example of the oxidative system being used to reproduce and resynthesize ATP. And the work to rest ratio is going to be 1 to 1 or 1 to 3. We did circuit training for 5 minutes. And so for those 5 minutes that you worked hard for, now you deserve a 5-minute break or a 15-minute break because the ratio is 1 to 1 to 1 to 3. Okay, so it sounds very simple, but just know these numbers on top of your head. Very important to know these systems because they keep coming back in later lectures, and that is it. This is the same slide. That's how important it is, I guess. All right, so thank you guys for watching this video. If you enjoyed it or you found it helpful, I would really appreciate a subscribe or turning the notifications on. Or if you have any questions, leave it in the comments below, like I always say, and thanks.